on DAF Nun Dalet Amud Aleph, and this is the adult rated blot, right? Because we're talking about different methods of sexual contact as a way of performing the mitzvah of Yibum. And we talked about yesterday in the Mishnah that it doesn't matter how the sexual act is performed, whether it's b'shogeg, ba'ones, whether it's intentional, unintentional, forced, whether it's normal entry, rear entry, all of these cases achieve the mitzvah of Yibum. So the Gemara's question today is, Minahani mil, from where do we know this? So that's where we're up to. It's about the 8th line in the Gemara. The Tanu Rabbanan, the Brisa says, Yevama yavo aleha. Her yavam shall come upon her, is what the Torah says, writing about the mitzvah of Yibum. So mitzvah, that tells me, those words teach me that if you have the option of either doing Yibum or Chalitza, it is preferred to do Yibum over Chalitza. That davar acher, Yevama yavo aleha, ben b'shogeg, ben b'mezid, ben ba'ones, ben b'ratzam. Another explanation is that when it says yavo aleha, that he shall come upon her, means unconditionally. It doesn't matter how, whether it's done intentionally or unintentionally or even forced, that consummates the Yibum. So the Gemara says, Vaha fikte lemitzvah. But one second, how can you use one pasuk to teach you two things? It's either, make up your mind. You just a moment ago told me that it's to teach me that Yibum is preferred over Chalitza. So the Gemara says, Lemitzvah meve'im lo yachbot so ish nafka hachafetz yabein. V'chi asakra bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'ones, bein b'ratzam. So the Gemara says, you're right. Really, the fact that it's preferred to do Yibum over Chalitza is derived from another pasuk. The pasuk says that if a man does not want to do Yibum, he has an option of doing Chalitza. That implies that Chalitza is the fallback position. It's the second option. But the first option is Yibum. So that tells me that it's preferable to do Yibum over Chalitza, and therefore this pasuk of Yevama Yavo Aleha teaches me that no matter how the sexual act is performed, it performs the mitzvah of Yibum. Tanya Idach, now we have another brisa. Yevama Yavo Aleha Kedarka, that the first three words, Yevama Yavo Aleha, teaches me that if the sexual act is performed normatively, meaning entry in her normal sexual orifice, so that is the mitzvah of Yibum. Ulekacha shelo kedarka. But when the Torah adds an additional word, ulekacha, he shall take her, this teaches me that even if he performs the sexual act through anal entry, that also performs the mitzvah. V'yibeim. Now you have the word in the Torah of v'yibima. So v'yibima, the whole word is superfluous, but we divide it into two parts. One is without the letter hey at the end, and then we add the letter hey. So v'yibima, read it first as v'yibeim. Bia gomeres ba. That word teaches me that it is the act of bia that consummates the yibum, and ve'en kesef ishtar gomer, but to the exclusion of the other methods normally of marriage, which are kesef and shtar, which are money and contract. And v'yibima, and the actual letter hey, teaches me that bal korcha, that even if the sexual act is forced upon her, so then it still is. In other words, she does not have to consent to yibum in order for the yibum to work. Now, obviously, we don't force her to do yibum. What it's saying is that b'di'evid, if she was forced and she didn't want it, nevertheless, she's still halachically married to the yavam. Yeah.
I understand that lekacha would mean in a non-normative fashion, but if the whole point of Yibum is to procreate and have children, to have the name of the brother survive, why would that even...
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. You're asking a philosophical question and asking a halachic question. The answer is that the Torah says make sexual contact and then fulfill the mitzvah of procreation. In other words, the thing that the mechanism that creates the marriage between the two of them doesn't necessarily have to be the same mechanism that will allow her to become pregnant. It just has to be a sexual act. Davar acher, Yevamo yavo aleha bein b'shogeg chulei. Then the Brisa continues and it says that another explanation of Yevamo yavo aleha means that even if the person did it unintentionally or was coerced, he still fulfills the mitzvah of Yibum. Frak the Gemara, v'ha fikte l'chedarka. But didn't you use the first part of that pasuk to teach me that if it's normative entry, that's how you fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum? Hahu milahakim la'achiv shem nafka b'makom shemekayem shem b'chi asakra bein b'shogig bein b'mezid bein ba'onas bein b'ratzon. So this goes back to what Alan just mentioned a moment ago. Really, I know that the mitzvah of Yibum is performed through a normative sexual act from a different pasuk, because it says that the function of Yibum, or the purpose of Yibum, is to create a memory for your brother by procreating, and that can only be done through the normal vaginal entry, right? So therefore, the pasuk is left of Yevamo Yavo Aleha to teach me that no matter how he performs the act, he still fulfills the mitzvah of Yibum, even if it was forced or unintentional. Gufa, Amar Rav Yehuda. So now let's go back to something that we learned yesterday. Moish, welcome back. You see, the world has changed in Yevamos from the time that you left until the time that you came back. So, anyway, we went from rated G to mature. Gufa. Amar Rav Yehuda, Yashen lo kana biyavimto. The Rav Yehuda was quoted as saying yesterday that if a man is asleep and his Yevama comes upon him and he performs a sexual act while asleep, he does not fulfill the mitzvah. And that's also derived from Yevamo Yavo Aleha, that he has to have intent. In other words, even though that pasuk told me that even if it's done against his will, he still fulfills the mitzvah, but at least he has to be cognizant that he's performing a sexual act. If he's unconscious, so then that pasuk also tells me that he's not fulfilling the mitzvah. So frek the Gemara, yes.
If she gets pregnant from that,
it wouldn't make a difference. He's not married to her. He has to do it again in order with knowledge in order to be married to her. So now the Gemara says, V'hatanya bein er bein yashen. I mean, it's an interesting point that you're raising. It's possible for him to have a child even before fulfilling the mitzvah of Yibum. Okay. V'hatanya bein er bein yashen. So 1 second, the Gemara says, don't we have a brisa that says it makes no difference whether he's awake or asleep? The mitzvah of Yibum is still performed. So the Gemara says, Ema bein era bein yashena. No, it means whether she's awake or asleep. He's got to be awake. But if she's asleep, the mitzvah of Yibum is still performed. So now the Gemara says, but wait a minute. V'hatanya bein erhu, bein yashenhu, bein erahi, bein yashenahi. But the brisa says, we have another brisa that states explicitly that it makes no difference whether he's asleep or whether she's asleep. Either way, the mitzvah of Yibum is performed. Boy, I'm just getting tired reading this. So the Gemara says, Hacha b'may askinan b'misnamne. So the Gemara's answer is, that brisa which says that you fulfill the mitzvah while sleeping is talking about not a real deep sleep, but what's called a drimmel. Very good. Very good. That's why Mendel came in at this moment, to be able to... Her specialty, right? So it's called a misnam name. It's a drimmel, which means a dozing or semi-sleepy state.
How do you say it in English? A drimmel?
A drimmel, a snooze, or like a semi-sleep.
No, it's a dream.
catnap.
I know that's literal. It's a dream.
And so the Gemara says, "Heichi dami misnam name." Explain to us what kind of quasi sleep state are you in? So Amar Ravashi, nim velonim tir velotir. You're asleep, but you're not asleep. You're awake, but you're not awake. Kigon dekarule va'ani velo yada lahadure svara v'chimad karule midkar. So the way that it works is, we've seen this many times in Shas, that a guy's like, you just imagine the guy on his recliner in the family room, and he just had his Friday night meal, and he lifted up the paper to read, and all of a sudden, about 3 seconds later, his eyes close. So they say, Abba. He says, Abba. And then, right, so then but he doesn't know how to say anything intelligent. And then the next day, when they remind him, Abba, you remember we were calling your name? He says, yeah, I remember, but I was just too sleepy. So that's in other words, you're semi-conscious, semi-asleep.
We wouldn't want to do that experiment here this morning.
Right. I'm sure some people are perpetually in that state. But in any event, the Gemara says that's what the Bryce is referring to when it says you can fulfill a mitzvah of Yibum in the semi-sleepy state, but not in a full sleepy state. So Gufa Amar Rabba Nafal min Hagag v'Niska Chayiv Barba Dvarim Uviyavimto Lokana. So now let's go back to our other interesting case that we saw yesterday about the guy that falls off the roof while he's having an erection, and he lands directly on the bullseye, and there's a woman underneath the roof who happens to be his Yevama. And in that situation, the Gemara says that he has not fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum, even though he's performed the sexual act, but he's also going to be liable to compensate her for any damages that he's caused her through that acrobatic act. So what is he chayiv to pay her? Benezek, bitzar, besheves, beripoy. He's got to pay her nezek, which means any physical damage that he's caused her. Tsar, that's suffering, so it's pain and suffering. Sheves is any time she's not able to work because he broke her leg in the same time, right? And Beripo, he's got to pay her medical bills. Aval boishes lo michayv. Now, there's a fifth type of nezek that's described in Bava Kama called boshes, which is when you humiliate a person by either removing her virginity or causing her to be humiliated in some other way. That you don't have to pay a woman in this situation because it wasn't intentional. Because the only time that you're chayiv for humiliating a person is if you intend to inflict harm upon them, and that causes them humiliation. But in this case, it was an accident. So Amar Rava, niskaven lahatiach bekoisel v'itiach b'yavemto lo kana, lahatiach b'vehema v'itiach b'yavama kana. Okay, let's go weiter. Echad hame'areh. So then the Mishnah had said that it makes no difference whether you perform a partial insertion or a full insertion. A partial insertion was what the Mishnah had called ha'ara'ah, or me'areh in the verbal form. So Amar Ula, minayin la ha'ara'ah min ha'torah. So Ula says, how do you know that the act of ha'ara'ah is considered to be a sexual act? Where do you see this in the pasuk? Shenamar v'isha sher yishkav es isha dava v'gilas ervasa es mekara ha'ara mikan laha'ara min ha'torah. Because when the Torah talks about the isser of being intimate with a nida, it says the verb he'era. So that tells me the word he'era implies a partial insertion, and that's how we know that when you have this encounter with an erva, you're performing the sexual act. So ashkecha nida shara arayos minayin, but that only is about a nida. How do you know that other arayos you're also going to be liable with just the hara? V'chite menelaf minida. Maybe you'll tell me, learn it out from the laws of nida. Ma lenida shekain mitam is boala, but maybe nida's more chamor because when a man has relations with a nida, he himself becomes tameh, whereas by other asur encounters, the man doesn't become tameh. So ela asya me eshes ach tichsiv v'isha sher yikach es eshes achiv nida hi, because the Torah says, okay, so we learn it out from the fact that eshes ach, if you have relations with your brother's wife, it's called a nida. So that connects it to a nida. So the Gemara says, v'chi eshes achiv la'olam nida hi. Why would the Torah call her a nida? She's not a nida all the time. So ela kenida. Ma nida beha'ara, af eshes ach beha'ara. So therefore the Gemara says, just like by a nida, you're chayiv for ha'ara, so too for an eshes ach, you're chayiv for ha'ara. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, maybe it's limited only to cases that are just like eshes ach, but not to all arayos. Mala eshes ach shekein biyadu l'rabos diboy mekadesh va'azil ki alpha. So it's a very interesting distinction that the Gemara is making. I'm not aware of the fact that the Gemara makes this distinction anywhere else. But you can actually distinguish between different kinds of relations that are usher because of erva. One relation is usher because of marriage. Like, my brother's wife is usher to me not because she's a blood relative, but rather because she's married to a blood relative of mine. And therefore, in theory, maybe the only reason why the Torah is so machmir to aser ha'ara is because potentially I could increase the number of those kinds of relatives exponentially by marrying all different kinds of people. In other words, if I marry 2 women, I double the number of people that are usher to me because of relationships. If I marry 3 women, I triple that. I can have up to 1,000 different forbidden women to me based on the number of people that I marry and how large her family base is. So therefore, maybe the Torah is machmir by an Eishes Ach because of the unlimited potential of usher relatives. But maybe when it comes to blood relatives, the Torah would not be machmir by ha'ara. So ela asya me'achos ava achos aim. So you're right, says the Gemara, you need a pasuk to talk about blood relatives as well. And we do have such a pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, because it says, Ve'ervas achos imacha va'achos avicha lo sigalei, ki es sha'aro he'era. You have the same verb that's listed in regard to your aunt, that is either your father's sister or your mother's sister. And there it also says he'era. So you see that even a blood relative is usher to you. But ikal mifrach mala achos ava achos aim shekain iser haba me'elav. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. But maybe there's a certain stringency by a blood relative because she's intrinsically usher to you, and it's not something that happens through an act of marriage. Like Rashi explains, right? Velo tifshot mina arayos and erasos lo machmas kiddushin. Maybe relationships that are only created later in life, that are not inherent, that are not blood relatives, maybe those are not as chamer. So, in other words, you can go in either direction. You can argue that on the one hand, relatives through marriage are more chamer, but you could also argue that blood relatives are more chamer. So you really need a source for both. So the Gemara says, you know what, you're right. You're right. So I need more than just one source text. I need perhaps 2 source texts, and from those 2, I can learn everything else. So mehete, see which 2 texts? Learn it from both of those. Learn from your brother's wife and from your aunt. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, but maybe those are only by those are asur because they're relatives. What about forbidden relationships for non-relatives? Let's say a nida, and let's say an eishes ish, a married woman. She's not usur to me because she's related to me in any way, but rather because of marriage. So again, how do you know about those that ha'ara is going to be usur? Okay, I'll give you 2. The real 2 texts are nida and your aunt. So those 2, one of them is a relative, one's a non-relative, and therefore you learn it from those 2. But malahanach shekain iser haba me'elav. But in both of those cases, there's an intrinsic iser, meaning that the iser is not a result of marriage. The iser is the result of a woman's menstrual state or a woman being my blood relative. So maybe I wouldn't learn from those 2 a case of where she's usher to me because of marriage. So elatese minida ve'eshasach demai parachta. So the Gemara says, you're right. Okay, let's take these 2 texts, nida and eshasach. Nida is usher to me because of something intrinsic to her, because she's menstruant, and Eishasach is usher to me because of marriage. From those 2 I learn that all other arayos are going to be usher in the case of ha'ara. So maskif la ravacha berei de ravika, but malanida ve'eshasach shekain ein lahem heter b'chaye osran, tomer be'eshes ish shekain yesh laheter b'chaye osra. So Rav Achas asked the following question, which you have to think about conceptually for a second. He says, in both the case of a nida and my brother's wife, in the lifetime of the origin of the isser, I'm never going to be able to be mutter to that woman. In other words, what is the source of this woman's isser to me in the case where she's my brother's wife? It's my brother. Even if my brother were to divorce her, she would still be usher to me until my brother, even in the lifetime of my brother, right? It's only after my brother dies and he dies without children that I'm allowed to marry her. The same thing. What causes this menstruant woman to be usher? Her bleeding. So in the lifetime of her bleeding, so to speak, her blood, so to speak, while her blood is still there, she's always going to be usher to me. But in the case of an eishes ish, a married woman, even though the man who caused her to be usher to me is still alive, she will be permitted to me if he divorces her. So therefore, maybe it's not as chamor in a case of Eishes. Maybe the ha'ara is not a consummation of the Yisr in that case. So the Gemara says, Amalei Ravacha midifti l'Ravina, Atu nida ve'eshes ach b'chaye osran hu de'ein lahem heter, aval achar mikan yesh lahem heter. He says, I'm sorry, but you're not phrasing the question correctly. Conceptually, that's not the way it works. The reason why a woman becomes mutter if she's my brother's wife is not because my brother died. And the reason why a menstrual woman becomes mutter to me is not because her bleeding stops, but rather because she goes through 7 days of purification. So it's not. So the way that you phrase the question is inaccurate. So nida biyome talya milsa neishasach bebanim talya rachmana. He says when it comes to a nida, it's days of counting that allows her to become permitted to me. So even if she bleeds for 1 day, she's still going to be usher for 7 days. And furthermore, in Eishesach, my brother's wife is not mutter to me just because my brother died, but rather because he died and didn't leave over children. So therefore, there are other factors involved in those cases. Therefore, if you're going to ask a question, ask the question this way: Ela pri chachi malanida ve'eshesach shekein ein osran matiran tomar ve'eshes isha osra matira. But rather, the question you can ask is like this: if you're only going to be learning from nida and eishesach, in both of those cases, the thing that made them usher is not the thing that makes them mutter. But for an Eishes Ish, the thing that makes her usher is the thing that makes her mutter. What do we mean by that? What makes a nida usher? Her menstruation. Does the menstruation alleviate the Isser? No, you need something else. You need a counting of 7 days. Similarly, what makes my brother's wife usher to me? The fact that my brother married to her. Does his death alone alleviate that Isser? No. He has to die, plus he can't have children. So therefore, you have other factors in there that make her Isser to me beyond the original source of the Isser. And therefore, maybe they're more chamor than simply an Eishes Ish, a married woman. What made the married woman Isser to me? Her husband. What makes her now permitted to me if she's no longer married to this man? So therefore, maybe it's not as chamor. And how do you know, therefore, that ha'ara is usher by Eishes Ish as well? So Ela Amar Reb Yonah v'itema Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua Amar Kra ki kol asher ya'aseh mikol ha'toevos ha'ela v'nichrusu ha'nefashos ha'osos. So rather, the pasuk says that anyone after the Torah lists in Parshas Achremos, which is Leviticus chapter 18, after the Torah lists all of the forbidden relationships, including Nida, it says anyone that does any of these things shall get kares. So we see Hukshu kol harayos kulan lenida. Ma Nida baha'ara, af kol baha'ara. And therefore, if Nida is singled out, that an act of ha'ara is usher, so too by all of the arayos in that paragraph are going to be usher baha'ara. So now that we've used this pasuk in Achremos to teach me that concept, why then does the Torah use the verb he'era in the context of Eishesach? It's not coming to teach me that law, so what is it coming to teach? L'chid Rav Huna, D'amar Rav Huna, remez liyavamim min haTorah minayin. Because Rav Huna had said, where is there an allusion to the mitzvah of Yibum in the Torah? So the Gemara says, I don't understand your question. Minayin haksiv yavamo yavo aleha. It's explicit. It's not. You don't need a remez. The Torah says explicitly the mitzvah of yibum. Ela remez liyavama she'asura b'chaye bala minayin. So the answer, rather the question really is, where do you see that my brother's wife is usher as long as my brother is alive? Meaning like this: even if my brother were to divorce her, how do I know that my brother's ex-wife is going to be usher to me? So how do you know this? And Gemara says, what are you talking about? Hai svarahi mid'amar rachmana la'achar misas ba'ila sharia michlal debechaye bala asura. Listen, the Gemara says, but wait a minute, isn't it just logic? If the Torah only gives me a permissibility to marry her after my brother is deceased, then that implies by definition that if my brother is still alive, she's going to be usher to me. So the Gemara says, no. V'dilma la'achar misas ba'ila mitzvah b'chaye bala rishus. Maybe all the Torah means to say is that after my brother dies, there's a mitzvah for me to marry her, but before he dies, if it's just his divorcee, there's no mitzvah for me to marry her. But it's not usher either. Inami la'achar misas baila in b'chaye balalo v'lav haba michlal aseh aseh. Or alternatively, maybe your inference is correct. The Torah only gives me permission to marry her once my brother is deceased. But from that I infer that I'm not allowed to marry her when he's still alive, but maybe it's only an Isser Aseh. How do you know that it's an Isser that carries with it Kares? So Amar Kra, V'isha shir yikach es eshes achiv nidahi. And that's why the Pasuk has to explicitly state in the Parshas Kedoshim, which is 2 chapters later, that if a man marries his brother's wife, he's committing an act of nidah. That v'chi yeshes achiv nidahi. Since when is she a nida? She's not always a nida. Ela kin nida. She's like a nida. Ma nida afal pi sheyesh laheter la'achar mikan bishas isura b'kares. Af eshes achnami afal pi sheyesh laheter la'achar mikan b'chaye bala b'kares. So that's what it's coming to teach me, is that it's very much like a nida. Even though a nida will eventually become permitted, but right now she's aser, so too my brother's wife, even though there is a possibility of her becoming permissible through the act of yibum, but nevertheless, as long as my brother is alive, there's an isser of kares attached to her. So ela ha'ara d'chsiva gabi achos ava achos ein lamali. So now let's go, okay, fine. But we have another pasuk that uses the verb he'era, which we said now we don't really need. And that's the one written by my aunt, either my father's sister or my mother's sister, which is an erva. Why does the verb he'era appear in that pasuk? L'chidaba mine ravina me rava hame'ara b'zachar mahu. Because Rava was asked the question by Ravina. He said, what if a man has only partial insertion into another male? He performs a homosexual act with only partial insertion. So the Gemara says, what kind of question is that? B'zachar mishkavei isha kesiva. There it's mishkav, the Torah says that whatever the homosexual act is usher if it imitates a normal sexual act with a female. So therefore, whatever is usher with a female will be usher with a male. So that's not a question. Ela hama'ara b'behema mahu. So rather the question is, what if a man performs an act of bestiality and only does a partial insertion? Is he liable? So Amar lei im eino inu laha'ara d'chsiva gabi achos ava achos eim da'asya behekesha me de Rabbi Yona teneu inu laha'ara d'behema, the period. So the answer is like this. You know what? We have this extra verb he'era that appears by your aunt. We don't need that verb because I already know that the Torah connects everything to nida. And if the Torah already connects everything to nida, why does that verb there? So we have this concept that sometimes a halacha will be referenced in one place, and you can really apply it because if it's extraneous over there to another halacha. So take the verb he'era that appears by your aunt and apply it to the pasuk of bestiality, which is not connected to all human acts of sexuality. And from there you'll learn that he'era by a behema is also aser. So the Gemara now says, Mechti behema chayvi misas beistin hi, my time aksiv lahara dida gabi chayvi krisos, lichtav gabi misas beistin. V'nelef misas beistin mi misas beistin. So the Gemara asks a very legitimate conceptual question. I understand the concept that sometimes a word will appear in place A and I apply it to place B. But you would assume that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who wrote the Torah, wrote it with logic, and therefore there should be some connection between A and B. But over here, why would HaKadosh Baruch Hu put the verb he'era to apply to an isser of bestiality if the source word appears as only an isser kares, and it's meant to be applied to an isser, a capital isser? Wouldn't it have made more sense for the verb he'era to appear in a pasuk which is an isser misas beistin, a capital violation, so that it could be applied to another capital violation? Why did the Torah write it this way? So the Gemara answers, Aidi de kule kra lidrasha asi, ksiv beinami hamilsa lidrasha. And the answer is that I register your question, but there's another overriding feature of this pasuk. This pasuk is filled with extraneous verbiage to be able to apply to a whole bunch of different halachic situations. And therefore, since this whole pasuk by an ant has so many of those extraneous words, this word also was inserted in there as well. So now the Gemara says, my drasha. So what makes this pasuk so rich with drashas, with exegetical information? The Tanya, ervas achos avicha lo sigale. And the answer is like this. The truth of the matter is that we have another pasuk that appears in Parshas Acharemos, which talks about the issur of having an encounter with your aunt. It says, the nakedness of your father's sister you may not expose. And this teaches me, bein min ha'av, bein min ha'em. This teaches me that my father's sister is usher to me, even if it's only a half-sister, either a paternal half-sister or a maternal half-sister. Ata omer bein min ha'av, bein min ha'em, o eno ela min ha'av, elo min ha'em. But maybe you'll say no. Maybe if it's only my father's half-sister, she'll only be usher if it's his paternal half-sister, but not if it's his maternal half-sister. V'dinu, chiev kan v'chiev ba'achoso. Ma'achoso bein min ha'av bein min ha'em, av kan bein min ha'av bein min ha'em. But then the Gemara says, the Brisa says, make the logical argument. The Torah prohibits my sister. And it makes no difference if she's only my paternal sister or my maternal sister. The Torah asers her equally. So say the same thing by my aunt. It makes no difference whether she's my father's half-sister from the father or from the mother. Oh, klach l'derech zu, or maybe no. Maybe you can make the opposite argument. Chiev kan v'chiev b'dodaso. Ma dodaso min ha'av v'lo min ha'em, af kan min ha'av v'lo min ha'em. Now, we're going to see the case of Doda. What is the case of Doda? A Doda is my father's brother's wife. It's not my aunt in the conventional sense of my blood relative. It's my aunt through marriage. That's what the Torah calls Dodaso. And that there's a separate pasuk to say that she's usher. And as we'll see momentarily, she's only usher to me as an erva if it's my father's brother through the father. If it's my father's half-brother paternally, so then his wife is an erva to me. But if it's my father's half-brother from the mother, then his wife is not prohibited to me as an erva. So therefore you could argue that the same thing, if it's my aunt, meaning if it's my father's sister, maybe she's only usher to me if it's my father's paternal sister, but not the maternal sister. But then the Gemara says, Nira lami doime, dan in isser haba me'elav me'isser haba me'elav, but let's see, what is my aunt more resemblant to? Is she more resemblant to my sister or more resemblant to my uncle's wife? On the one hand, you could say she's more resemblant to my sister because just like my sister is a blood relative, so too is my father's sister a blood relative. Oh, klach l'derech zeh, dadin krovei ha'av mikrovei ha'av al tochiach achoso shekrovei atzma. But maybe just the opposite. Maybe you'll argue that my brother's sister is more analogous to my father's brother's wife because they're both usher to me as relating to my father. In other words, they're usher to me because they're my father's relative. And maybe my sister is different because she's directly related to me, and she's not usher to me because of my father. So therefore, we're not sure how to look at it, and therefore, Talmud Lomar, Ervas Achos Avicha Lo Sigale. And that's why we need the later pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim to clarify that point that was not made clear in Parshas Acharemos. Here in Parshas Kedoshim it says, do not expose the erva of your father's sister. And therefore, the reason why it's mentioned the second time is to teach me bein min ha'av, bein min ha'em, to tell me that it makes no difference whether it's my father's paternal sister or his maternal sister. And then it also says in that the very next pasuk, ervas achos imcha lo sigale, that do not expose the nakedness of your mother's sister, bein min ha'av, bein min ha'em. And there too, just like by the father's sister, it makes no difference whether she's maternal or paternal, so too by my mother's sister, it makes no difference whether it's from the father or from the sister. So now the Gemara says, Lama li lamichtava ba'achos av, Lama li lamichtava ba'achos eim. So frak the Gemara, why do I need an extra pasuk for both? In other words, just write an extra pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim telling me that my father's sister is usher, and then I'll know that it makes no difference whether it's paternal or maternal, and I'll make the same application to my mother's sister. So Amar Rebbe Avohu Tzrichi, I'll tell you why. Di'ikas of Rachmana ba'achos av, sheken yesh lachayas, aval achos eim emolo. You want to know the reason? If the Torah would have only given me the extra pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim for my father's sister, I might not necessarily know that the same applies to my mother's sister, that it makes no difference whether it's her maternal or paternal sister. Why? Because maybe my father's sister is a closer relative, because all of one's yichus comes through the father, his tribal yichus and so forth. And therefore she's more closely related to me. However, my mother's sister, where my yichus doesn't come from through my mother, maybe my mother's sister is only usher to me if she's my mother's paternal sister. The ikas of Rachmana ba'achos eim shekain vadois of alachas av emolo tzricha. And if the Torah would have only ushered my mother's sister, both maternally and paternally, I could have argued that we have to be more machmer there, because you know for sure that she's your aunt. But your father, you don't know for sure that your father is your father. There's no one who can witness that your father is your father. And therefore maybe we're not as machmir by the father's sister as we are with the mother's sister. And therefore you need both psukim. Now the Gemara says, V'dodaso depshita le'latana demin ha'ava lo min ha'eminole. Let's go back to that statement that we learned before. A doda, which we explained is your father's brother's wife. We said that it has to be your father's brother from the paternal relationship and not from a maternal relationship. Now, how do you know this? That my uncle's wife is only usher if it's my uncle from a paternal brotherhood to my father and not from a maternal brotherhood. How do you know that? So Amar Rava Asyo Dodo Dodo. We have a Gezerah Shava from the word Dodo. Ksiv Hacha Ervas Dodo Gila. It says over here that you've uncovered your uncle's nakedness. Uchasiv Hasam O Dodo O Ben Dodo Yigalenu. And a little bit later in Parshas Bahar, it says that if a man is sold into slavery, his closest relative has to buy him back, has to redeem him. And it gives different examples of relatives, one of them being his uncle. Now, Ma'alahalan min ha'avalo min ha'em, Afkan min ha'avalo min ha'em. Just like when it comes to redeeming a slave, it's only referring to your uncle that's your father's half paternal brother and not your father's maternal brother. So too over here, when we talk about the isser of your uncle's wife, it's only when he's a paternal brother to your father and not a maternal brother. Bahasaminol. And how do you know in Parshas Bahar that it's only a mitzvah for your father's paternal brother to redeem you? Because Amar Kra mi mishpachto yigalenu. Mishpachas av kruya mishpacha, mishpachas eim eina kruya mishpacha. The answer is because it says in the pasuk in Parshas Bahar, someone from the mishpacha should redeem you. Anyone that's related to you from a maternal relationship is not called mishpacha, which is a little bit sad to say, right? Now, don't take it personally if you're closer to your mother's side than you are to your father's side. But the point is that the Gemara says the word mishpacha essentially means someone that's related to you from the father's side. So therefore, if this man is your uncle because he's your father's paternal brother, so only then he has a mitzvah of redeeming you from slavery. But if he's your father's maternal brother and the relationship therefore is only from the mother, it's not considered to be the same kind of familial connection. V'haditnan amrulo. So now the Gemara asks another question. So now you're telling me essentially that sometimes a forbidden relationship is only going to be forbidden if it's a paternal relationship and not a maternal relationship. Look at the following Mishnah. Amrulo Mesa Ishtecha. That this is a little bit of a convoluted case. We're not going to go through all of the permutations of it. But let's say a guy marries a woman, and they tell him, your wife died. V'nasa achosa me'aviha. He then goes ahead, thinking that his wife is dead, and he marries his wife's sister, but only his paternal sister, only the wife's paternal sister. Then they tell him again, oh, sorry, your second wife is dead. V'nasa achosa me'ima. And then he marries that woman's maternal sister. So woman number 3 that he marries is related to his second wife, but is not at all related to his first wife. Then Mesa, then he gets news that the third wife is dead, V'nasa achosa me'aviha, and he marries her paternal sister. Mesa, then he gets news that the fourth wife is dead, V'nasa achosa me'ima, and then he marries her maternal sister. So it turns out that you only have 1 and 2 are related, 2 and 3 are related, 3 and 4 are related, and 4 and 5 are related. So the way it works is like this. Then they come back and tell him whoops, we made a mistake. They're all alive. So now the question is, who is he halachically married to, and who is he not halachically married to? It turns out that the second woman he married is Achos Ishto, is the sister of his wife, and was never halachically married to her because he basically committed znus with her, because there's no tfisas kiddushin for an erva. Wife 3 he's halachically married to, wife 4 he's not halachically married to, and wife 5 he is halachically married. So mutter barishona vashlishus of achamishis, therefore he's married to wives 1, 3, and 5. Upotros tsorosehen, and therefore if he were to die and his brother were to do yibum or chalitza with one of those 3 women, he would exempt the other women that were married to the brother. Va'asr bashnio v'aravias vein bias echas mein poteres tzarasa. But he's not halachically married to wife 2 and 4. He's not allowed to be with them ever again. And if he were to die and one of the brothers did yibum with wife 2 or 4, that's not an act of yibum either, and therefore the tsaras would not be pater. Vimbal ashniya la'achar misas harishona mutter bashniya v'araviyas uposu saraseyan va'asr b'shlishus uv'achamishus. Now let's say wife 1 actually did die, and the only wives who didn't die were wives 2, 3, 4, and 5. In that situation, it just reverses. In that case, wife 2 is permitted, wife 3 is usher, wife 4 is permitted, and wife 5 is usher. And they just have to reverse the order of things, and the same thing with yibum. So what do you see from here? Alma achos ishto bein min ha'av bein min ha'em asuros. So you see from here that an achos ishto, that my wife's sister is usher to me, whether it's my wife's paternal sister or her maternal sister. And the question therefore becomes minalan. How do we know this? How do you know that even a maternal sister to my wife is usher to me? And that's the question that we will embark upon in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow.